I actually think you can teach children almost anything if you're able to engage with them, if you're able to speak with them appropriate to age and stage, and you adjust whatever content or concept it is. I actually think you can get really quite difficult and challenging things over to children of almost any age, and that we shouldn't be afraid of trying those things.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I am delighted to be joined by Stefan Horsman, who is the Head of Albyn School in Aberdeen. Stefan and I had a really fun conversation. We started off talking about his roots and why he turned to education as a career. And we unpack the idea that we're so commonly use phrases like education is a force for good and the transformative power of education. And even though these phrases just kind of slip off the tongue, we take the time to really understand what the power of education is and how that can make change in society. Stefan and I also talk a lot about values and mission and how it's really important to dive into both the history and the current values and ethos of your school to find your school's mission, and how you then need to be using storytelling techniques, so creating a narrative around its impact, especially if you're looking to be fundraising for bursaries or making changes around your bursary programme. Linking your school's mission to social justice and trends in society is really, really important. So I was fascinated to hear Stefan's views on this topic, and I'm really delighted to be sharing them with you today in this podcast. So before we dive into that conversation, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about Stefan. So he grew up in Bolton in Lancashire and then attended Bolton School, from where he went on to read geography at Magdalen College, Oxford. Via a short sojourn teaching in Malawi and some alumni and fundraising work back at Bolton School, he then did a PGCE at Queen's College in Cambridge. Stefan's geographical odyssey continued in his then first teaching post, which was at the Portsmouth Grammar School. Posts at Latimer Upper School and as head of geography at Cheadle Hulme also then followed. From there, and after an early midlife gap year, which saw him travel across Russia, as well as visiting North Korea, Panama, Brazil and Ecuador, you can see how the geography influenced his gap year there. He then went on to take up his first senior leadership position at Robert Gordon's College in Aberdeen. Following nearly 9 years there as deputy head, he took up the headship of Albyn School, also in Aberdeen, in April 2021. Really quickly, before we dive into the detail, I want to make sure that you make the most of the time you invest listening to this podcast. And the best way to do that is to make sure you grab a copy of my free ebook, The Strategic Independent School Leader. It outlines how to answer the 6 essential questions that will clarify your school's strategy and secure its future. In the world of business, strategy can be full of jargon, but it doesn't have to be that way. This is a jargon-free tool tailor-made to help private school leaders think and act more strategically. Download your free copy today at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/ebook. So let's dive into my conversation with Stefan Horsman. So hello, Stefan, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. It is wonderful to have you here with us today.
Hello, Juliette. Thank you. It's great to be able to join you.
Perfect. So I remember when you first made contact with me, it was after a webinar that I've been giving on strategy. I think it was fundraising strategy in particular, but touched on all sorts of elements of strategic thinking and strategy. And I still remember now that your first message to me was, it's wonderful to meet with another strategist. So I'm assuming that you come to this conversation from the point of view of enjoying strategy and loving strategy. Is that about right?
I do, yes. I suppose up until quite recently, I wouldn't necessarily have seen what I enjoyed as strategy.
Yes.
But I suppose the more I have learned about what strategy is has made me realize that I've probably been a strategist for about 25 years, a good deal of it without really realizing that that's what it was, because that to me has been normal, planning, thinking about 5 and 10 years ahead rather than just, what's immediately in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you and I probably on the same kind of trajectory of that. I've been doing it for many years, and then when I did my MBA, I suddenly thought, oh, that's what it is. That's what I enjoy. So interesting. But let's rewind a little bit before that, first of all. So I'd be fascinated to hear about the root of your passion for education. Why did you first become a teacher? What is it about working in schools that's kept you hooked pretty much through your career?
It's a good question. I think probably it's to do with that alchemic mix of people, of organizations, of buildings and logistics, but also, of course, the fact that education as a fundamental force for good is the way that we change anything in society. It's really the root cause, or the root source, should I say, of fundamental change. We have that power to, through education, I think, to influence people, to impart knowledge, to instill enthusiasm for learning. And I suspect, I know now, looking back at my own primary schooling and secondary schooling, that it's really through both of those two experiences that passion and that realization that education transforms lives, where that has really come from, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's easy, isn't it, to say things like education is a force for good and education transforms lives. And we sort of say, and it trips off the tongue, so we hear it everywhere. And it's interesting to actually reflect on for a moment the deep truth of that, the fact that actually by influencing the way that our young people grow up to be inquisitive, to be open to the world, to have a really robust sense of themselves, as well as holding, actual factual knowledge as well. But that love of learning, it really genuinely is the underpinning force for change, isn't it, in society?
Yes, I think that's it. And I reflect now, many years later, that I came from a house where education was always seen as very important, never overtly or explicitly so. I never felt pushed by my parents as such educationally, but I always enjoyed exploring things, new opportunities, travel. But I also realized that was backed up by both my small local state primary school and then Bolton School, where I went age 11 and did all of my secondary education. And in a sense, those two forces reinforcing one another and all moving in that direction of inquiry, inquisitiveness, enthusiasm for learning, for trying new things. And therefore, in a sense, although it only emerged in me as a conscious thought during university, I suppose really I had always been perhaps destined to go into teaching, because of those educational experiences over those first sort of 14 years in school, really.
Yeah. So fast forward a few years, obviously you start your career as a teacher and then through various different positions. Have you brought lessons from your own schooling or some of those early posts to your later leadership positions, would you say?
I think so. One of the things, again, that stuck with me from school, and again, of course, you don't realize this when you're at school because just whatever happens to you at that age, you perceive as normal. But just to take a small example, I realized in my teaching, really from very early on, that there were quite a few things I was teaching children that many of my colleagues would look at me a little confused and perplexed when I said, "Oh, I'm teaching spearman's rank to year 9 to the 14-year-olds," and they would say, "But we only do that in lower 6th or in upper 6th," and I guess I had that done to me, if you like, when I was a pupil at school. And I suppose what it's illustrative of is that I actually think you can teach children almost anything if you're able to engage with them, if you're able to speak with them, appropriate to age and stage. And you adjust whatever content or concept it is, I actually think you can get really quite difficult and challenging things over to children of almost any age, and that we shouldn't be afraid of trying those things with children who might seem to be younger in years or in intellectual maturity than you might normally be expected to do that topic with. Because, children constantly surprise you. They amaze you with how much they can take in, how much they can understand, if you convey that in an engaging and accessible way. And I suppose, the metaphor or the meta level picture of my own teaching was that I constantly challenged pupils. I constantly wanted to speak with them and level with them in a sort of adult way, in a mature way. And I wasn't fazed by bringing in things that others might perceive as being too hard for them or too difficult for them to understand at whatever particular age they were.
I think you're right. And I think that is the underlying talent, the skill that goes into teaching, is translating what can be quite complex content into the messages and the stories and the way you communicate it to the age group that's sitting in front of you. Not just the age group, but the individual characters who are sitting in front of you. Yes. And I have to say that one of my lessons through lockdown and homeschooling my own children has been that actually we need to hugely increase the value of early years and teachers, primary school teachers, people who are having to translate really complicated things into really simple building blocks that are then the foundation for later learning. And I've spent my entire life in education, either as a student or in my career, and even I reassessed my sense of awe about the way that is done so successfully in schools.
Yes, and I think primary school teachers, in a sense, are even more masterly at that sometimes than secondary teachers are, because they've got to break those topics down, to the very basics and convey that to children. And that's why I always think teaching is far more about people and storytelling than it is about necessarily having all the facts and all that great intellectual horsepower in the bank. I've seen people far more qualified than me, far more probably with far higher IQs than me, really struggle with conveying that sort of information to children and young people. And I've seen plenty of people, who on paper perhaps look less academic or less qualified, be absolutely wonderful, because what they have the gift of doing is explaining these sorts of concepts, often because that they've maybe had to learn that themselves and haven't always found that easy, but they just have such sort of skill and mastery at conveying that. And that kind of infectiousness for engaging children and young people with whatever it is they're doing, whether it's French or maths or physics. And that's really what you want, those teachers who are enthused of their own subject, but also are really good communicators and really clear at breaking difficult and challenging things down into a step-by-step set of concepts.
And I think that is absolutely what parents have learned to appreciate, having seen more straight in front of their eyes during home learning and lockdown. So obviously we've been through a really challenging couple of years with the pandemic. I know that you moved to Albyn School in April 2021. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to move mid-pandemic, and then any kind of shifts and changes that the schools that you've been working in have had to make as a result of that, of the pandemic, not just to the direct delivery, the operational delivery of the education, but to the strategic directions that you're taking?
Yeah, so I suppose the move to Albyn was as smooth as a move of school in a pandemic can be, not least because I'm only about a mile and a half down the road from where I was before, so I'm just grateful not to have moved house during the pandemic or uproot the whole family in that sense, although my children have moved over to Albyn from where I was before. Yes, and I think that's a well-made point in terms of reflecting on running a school in a pandemic. The operational things, in a sense, have been more immediate, more obvious, and perhaps without any sense that we could do anything other than just keep the show on the road. So going online, transferring parents' evenings, and all of those things to digital and remote means. I suppose what's being a head now has meant, and also, of course, being a deputy head in another school during the first part of the pandemic, was that it makes you reflect on what sort of things really have to be done in the way that they've always been done, and what sort of things you can now conceive of differently. And I think, at the heart of strategy is always asking the question, not just, what are we doing, but why are we doing it in this way? And are there different, perhaps better ways to do that? So to give one example, I suppose, it is the example of bringing former pupils into things and careers events and university-focused events and those sorts of things. And of course, schools have always worked with their alumni to a greater or lesser extent to involve them in the careers of those senior pupils that they've got who are just about to go into the world of work or university or whatever. And we had always tried, and often singularly, tried to bring them in, and they'd come and spend a day in their former school, and you'd have them in, and you'd give them lunch, and it would take all day, and they'd have travelled from London to wherever around the country it might have been. And now, of course, there's been an immediate and instant paradigm shift. You just beam those people in. It doesn't really even matter if they're in the UK. You just try and arrange a suitable time. And, it's those sorts of shifts and almost kind of about faces. And you start to think of how that might work for some of the major school events in the year, whether that's prize giving, whether that's concerts. How do you draw in a wider audience because you're now going to stream your events? And are any of us truly going to go back to exactly what we did before? I think probably not. And I think it's, should make us all think about the things we do and ask, is this the most effective way? Is this the best way to engage that particular constituency or audience? I've just been having a chat today because the Scottish Qualifications Authority have been putting information out about next year's exams. What if? And online exam platforms, all sorts of things that one could consider, which were perhaps not really thought of or only in the realm of university courses or MOOCs previously, are now suddenly things that schools have just got to turn their hand to. But actually, it might improve things. It might speed things up. It might engage people more or constituencies more. And I think that's the name of the game, because we've got to be nimble organizations. We've got to find ways to be more time efficient, more cost efficient. We've got to think longer term in terms of 20 and 30 and 50 year horizons, and not just, 2 or 3 or 5 year ones.
Yes, and of course lifting your head up to even look a couple of years ahead when you're coping with the operational challenges of the pandemic has been quite a challenge for many. What I find really interesting about what you've just shared there is that, yes, strategy is about looking at, okay, so why are we doing it this way? What's our underlying purpose in delivering parents' evenings, for example, and then how can we adapt it? That's just an instinctive response. It feels operational, but actually what that kind of process can do is open up new opportunities. So one of the things that I think people have been focusing on more and more is what I would call leverage. So it's leveraging what you're doing in your school and what you're kind of committed to doing. You still have to do, you always have to do. So the activities that are kind of non-negotiable on your timetable, but then thinking, how can we leverage that input, that effort, that time, that energy, enthusiasm that goes into those activities and get an even better output? So maximize that output, get an even bigger result. And I think your example there about opening up access to some school events is a really easy way of thinking about this. So, for example, your school may be putting on a theatrical production or prize giving or carol concert or anything like that. In the past, it would have been very much restricted by how many seats you've got in your audience, who's in your geographical reach, who can actually get there and experience what you've put all this energy and effort into. It takes a lot of time, these big productions. Mm-hmm. And yet now, actually, you can record it. You can stream it live. You can record it and then have a little watch party with your alumni and the head and encourage everyone to have a little cup of tea together or whatever it might be on their Zoom call. And there's now multiple ways that you can use the effort, which would have gone in anyway and might have only been actually beneficial to those who are in the room. The same is true of the way you're delivering education. The same is true, as you mentioned, about bringing in careers talks and careers advice. Okay, so if we record these, we can build up libraries of them that sixth form students can access on demand, younger pupils can access on demand. So it's actually thinking really cleverly and strategically about, okay, we have to make some operational changes, but what are the opportunities? How can we leverage our efforts in a much bigger way?
Absolutely, and I think in some ways it's now beginning to feel like education can realize what you might call the fourth industrial or fourth technological revolution. I was engaged 7 or 8 years ago at my previous school for a couple of years in a seconded role, essentially as director of digital strategy, to really bring digital to teaching and learning, or bring learning or teaching and learning to digital, one way or the other. And I think we have seen the business model beyond teaching of things like music and broadcasting and publishing completely transformed by digital. And yet teaching had remained, if you like, in the Fordist or, kind of third industrial revolution type model, that children sit in front of you in serried ranks, are educated by batch, as if the date stamp on them is the most important thing. And, whilst we do that, obviously, still to a significant extent, you can now see how technology can change that. But you can also see, I think, how technology can you can harness that. The efforts of one person to broadcast assembly can now make it reach 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people, not just the 100 or 1,000 that you might have in front of you in the school. And again, to use an example, Parents' Evening seems pretty operational. It seems, in a sense, pretty banal that you say, well, it's gone online. But if parent surveys are to be believed, then communication and reporting on their children's progress is, if not the top thing that they report on, is always up there amongst the top 2 or 3 things that they're talking about. And yet schools look at that feedback and go, but the amount of effort that is required to write a set of reports or to run a Parents' Evening live in the building when people are maybe traveling 45 minutes each way to get in, and then it finishes at 9 and it's dark and so on, are so much that the barrier to entry is quite high, or the barrier to doing more of it is quite high. Suddenly with technology, you think, well, why are we writing written reports at all where teachers have become past masters at this sort of report speak, which says everything and yet nothing. And we have a process of weeks of writing them, of checking them, and then they go out and they're already 3 or 4 weeks, if not more, out of date. Why don't we jump online and have a parents' evening? It can be done in a couple of hours, even on the teacher side, and somewhere in the region of half an hour to an hour on the parent side, depending on how many appointments there are. And suddenly there is a win-win there that
absolutely.
has changed the game completely. Now, why we weren't doing that before, I don't really know. I think what's happened is, we have gone through the eye of the needle of the pandemic, is it's catalyzed these changes that, to be fair, have been happening for the last 8 or 10 or more years. But now they've suddenly accelerated, and suddenly people have been forced to look at the possibilities and go, oh, you know what, we could just do this, and it's quite easy.
Yeah.
There's not much of a barrier to entry in terms of the technology required, or the cost, or even the personnel required to run it. So let's just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see as well how that interconnects with bigger trends that are happening. So social trends and trends around forward feedability mean that actually most of the time now we're looking at parents where both parents are working, which puts even more pressure on that travelling across the city to get to the school for the parents' evening. It's quite a challenge. And also you can see how future change, or in fact existing technology, could make that a mixed model still around video and in-person video call. So actually there'd be no need for a written report. You do a short video recorded for each person, just teacher to camera, and then that's followed on a couple of weeks later once people have had a chance, the parents have had a chance to review those, with a face-to-face kind of Q&A opportunity, one-to-one. So you can really see how all of these different trends come together. They've been forced by COVID. We've been forced to move fast, but actually all of these things were happening already, and it's just sped up that change.
And the social trends amongst the kind of parents that we have now, I think if you look back 25, 30 years plus to my own school days, and, a thrice yearly written report, which was summative, didn't necessarily contain any formative feedback, was all handwritten, and probably was expected of parents sending, or by parents who are sending their child to that sort of school. Now I think that the world has moved on, things are faster, they're more immediate. I think parents are less stuffy, or they are just, that the current zeitgeist is that everyone's more relaxed about these things. And I think, that sense that some schools and heads might have had 15 or 20 or more years ago, that, the parents require a formal written report which is addressed to them and doesn't, and refers to their child in the third person and all of those sorts of things. I think we're beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think in a sense we were probably beyond that before the pandemic, and maybe there were quite a lot of parents looking at the school thinking, hang on a minute, the sector's a bit anachronistic here. And now we've kind of sped up. We've suddenly gone through about 4 gears in the last 18 months, and we're much more with where those beyond school were at, perhaps even before the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking ahead, what challenges do you think are kind of preoccupying school leaders at the moment? What kind of challenges do you see on the horizon, or even closer up?
I suppose the fundamental thing, the elephant in the room, if you like, is how do independent schools, where for 20 or 30 years the increases have outpaced the kind of earned income inflation of our parents, how do we square that circle? How do we retain that accessibility that 30 years ago independent schools had to families where one parent was a teacher and another was a doctor, or one was a gardener and the other one was a nurse? And they could, if they were aspirational for their child and believed education was important, that they could and would send their children to a school like Albyn or other schools like it. Now that's really very challenging, and I think the key thing, and quite rightly, our obligations, if you like, under the charity regulations, both here in Scotland and indeed in England and the rest of the UK, are such that we absolutely need to make sure that access is as wide as possible. But how do we do that without using more of our fee income, or the relatively high proportion of fee income that many schools like Albyn and indeed us too are using on that? How do we diversify our income streams? How do we create, if you like, endowed charities, endowed schools, endowed bodies that can offer this, as well as keeping things manageable for the parents? I think there's this view of independent school parents that, they're kind of almost endlessly wealthy, and there's an almost, a kind of non-diminishing supply of parents who might send their children to our sorts of schools. But I don't think that's the case. I think there's not necessarily a typical family. I think there are many families who are for whom education is a very high priority, who are striving and scrimping and saving and working really, really hard, as you said, 2 jobs, but also doing without a whole load of things, that second car, that 3rd or 4th holiday, that larger, nicer house, in order to invest in their child's future. But we know that is going to be more difficult. The situation here in the city is one where obviously things for Aberdeen, with the decline of the fossil fuel industry, is a significant case in point. But also, of course, the pandemic has thrown a sharp spotlight on many families' incomes and means, and we're going to have to think even more creatively about how we work, in a sense, to redistribute the wealth that exists within that wider school community, amongst those former pupils, who've made it good and so on, in order to reinvest that, in order to turn that wealth into a predisposition to give, into being philanthropists at whatever scale, mini philanthropists and maxi philanthropists, and kind of both, straight out re-endowers. How do we harness that? Because this is not just tapping into schools millionaires, it's tapping into those of more modest means, but have definitely got a warmth and a predisposition towards their former school to help with those sorts of things. So I still think that remains the biggest single and most fundamental challenge facing the sector in terms of its long-term sustainability or viability.
I think you're right, and this is something I feel really passionately about. So the challenge is circular in nature. You've got the fee affordability challenges, so the fee income compared to kind of average family salaries going up and up and up, and finding that actually the parents that you do have, they don't have as deep pockets. Not all of them, some of them do still, but you're not necessarily going to be able to continue to grow a bursary program or even start a bursary program for transformational bursaries for those who are really unable to access excellent education, at least in the independent sector, but whose parents wouldn't have the ability to pay. And so it makes it increasingly challenging to use fee income to cross-subsidise bursary programmes. And certainly where schools that I've been working with and speaking to are looking to grow their bursary programmes, it's almost entirely through that diversification of income streams that you mentioned, fundraising being a really key part of that. Obviously also commercial lettings when things loosen up a bit. That's still quite a challenge at the moment at this stage of the pandemic, but making money by hiring out school facilities, and of course the international kind of franchise model that can produce an income flow as well. But I think with the fundraising side, you're right, and I've been talking about this for decades now. The importance of having a culture of philanthropy in which everybody in your school community or educational community that you're in, everybody feels that they can do their bit and that bit makes a difference, simultaneously with really cultivating individual relationships with those who can make a really substantial gift, which on its own can really move the dial and make a big difference. And my passion is when schools have a really strong bursary story to tell. And it is all about storytelling. It's about kind of creating those stories around the values that you have as a school and the impact, the positive impact that you want to have on society, not only by the way that you educate your current pupils, but also by opening up access to that excellent education. Done well and with the right people in place and with enthusiasm and proper investment in the process, it's a momentum that builds in a community over time. And now is the time to start. There is no better time than now.
Well,
despite pandemic, now is the time to start. Really
I'm a great believer in just starting.
Yes.
Again, going back to that digital strategy that I ran at my previous school, we just had to make a start, and it wasn't always easy. It certainly wasn't necessarily perfectly planned. In a sense, it wasn't perfectly plannable, because a lot of the things we were doing at that stage were relatively pioneering. There weren't many examples, if any at all, of that sort of change on the kind of scale that we were doing it, and you've just got to get going. And just to go back to something else that you said, I think it's interesting that you say, absolutely right, that you say it's about storytelling and tuning into the values of the organization, the history of the organization, the story that there is there to tell. And I think sometimes, and I felt this a little bit on coming to Albyn, I wondered where we were going to be able to tap into anything to tell a story about philanthropy, because it's, as a former girls' school, went co-educational, 16 years ago, I didn't immediately see that there was, in fact, in terms of philanthropy, there is not that history and tradition that there certainly have been in some of the other schools I've worked. If I take Latimer Upper School and the fact that it was founded in 1624 by Edward Latimer for 8 poor boys of Hammersmith, and there it is written into the fabric of the school right from the beginning, you've obviously got an easy in.
Yeah, the story
but when I
is
came to think
there.
about a girls' school founded in 1867 by a very pioneering woman locally, whose whole focus in that latter third of the 19th century was part of this women's suffrage, women's female emancipation movement of getting access to the University of Aberdeen for women. It then made me realize that actually the mission at that point was all about widening access, to use a very 21st century phrase, was all about widening access, because there was this whole group in the city of girls and young women who had no access to higher education. And she was one of those pioneers, with the second head of the school banging on the door at the University of Aberdeen saying, come on, let us in to do degrees, let us in to access this education that's been the preserve of men. And then it struck me that although things have changed, and thank goodness, enormously for women in the 155 years since then, there are still many in this city and around the country who do not have that level playing field access to higher education, who do not have access to the kinds of transformational opportunities and facilities and co-curricular program that we have here. And that's actually our modern mission. That is to reinterpret why the school existed and to say, okay, women per se may not be the group these days who, in terms of access to higher education, are disadvantaged, but there are many in the city in areas of multiple deprivation, data that's really easy to get at these days, where we could absolutely target our program, and just as universities, certainly here in Scotland, have been doing, have a very clearly published widening access process that is followed, and open that up and engage with primary schools in that area and primary school head teachers and community organizations to really say, look, we're in this for the long term. We're returning essentially to the roots that we had 150 plus years ago, and this is our modern mission. So it sometimes takes a little bit of uncovering, a little bit of thinking, a little bit of learning the organization. But I think those hooks, if you like, are there onto which you can, put these stories and explain what you're trying to do, as well, of course, as providing a top-class education for those able to pay fees, those for whom it is, if you like, right to use those fees for the wider good, in the sense that schools, the independent sector, do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that actually, even though it's not as obviously apparent as many of those schools who have those ancient foundations, even more modern foundations with the purpose of providing an education, often for young, poor boys. In actual fact, what you found there is the connection through to serving a disadvantaged or an underrepresented group of people who didn't have a voice, and they wanted a voice. They were banging on the door of the higher education in kind of world and saying, let us in. And I think what now we've realized is that there's this intersectionality around disadvantage. And although there is work still to be done around the equal rights for women, a lot of that work now needs to happen in the workplace rather than in the school setting, although there's always work to be done. In actual fact, that intersectionality of disadvantage is showing up much more strongly in an income disadvantage and income deprivation, and also around race and the impacts, the complex interplay of impacts of all of these different kind of features of every individual, as unique as they are in our society. So linking it through to your history and finding a social narrative which is being listened to and being valued at the moment, and quite rightly so, hopefully for many generations to come, puts the school in a really strong position to be able to tell that narrative, create those stories. And those stories, sometimes I hesitate about the word storytelling. It sounds like you're creating a fiction. It's about rooting the storytelling in the reality of your school. It's about finding the narrative, if you like, to tell the story of why your school's values are still relevant today, and how they're interpreted and reinterpreted by every generation going forwards. Fantastic.
No, and I think that's what we're going to try to do. And it's that cliche of a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And I think you make these steps incrementally over time, and I think also have to demonstrate consistency and believability. I'm sure if and when we launch this, that there will be those saying, this is a gimmick, or this is not for the long term, or, schools such as this are not for the likes of us. And that's fine. People can say that. But I think that consistency, that, singularity of moral purpose, that sense that you're in it for the long term, and that this is a process, not just a single event, will over time, and certainly if you can weave that into the DNA of your own organization, never mind how that's received. But I think if you can do that, you will then convince the naysayers and the doom mongers over years that actually, no, this is what we stand for, and this is what we do, and this is what we believe in. What Tony Benn used to say, of certain people and organizations, that they were signposts and not weather vanes, and that's again a great mental image of what we want to be. And that is what I'm absolutely determined to do. I owe a huge amount to my own school. I was only able to stay there on a bursary award, and I know the power of education through over 20 years of being a teacher. And I think you harness those two things, and you can really be a force for good in the world. and take that mission more widely than the community that is currently served, without not continuing to serve the current community. That it's not an either or. It genuinely is a both and type thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us nicely back round to that idea of force for good. It's education force for good, not just for the individual, but also for parts of our community who deserve extra help, extra focus because of the history with which we've lived here in the United Kingdom and worldwide. I love to finish off our conversation, Stefan, with the idea of myths around the independent school sector. So there are myths kind of everywhere we look in our sector. What's the one common myth that really kind of annoys you that you would like to debunk if you could?
I suppose that our school is full of sort of entitled and rather posh or sometimes pompous pupils. I mean, those that I've taught in 5 schools now over more than the last 20 years have generally been grounded, have been kids are kids first, and rich or affluent or whatever second. And in any case, it largely isn't the pupils themselves who are that, but their parents. And we are, and I think when prospective parents come in, when we're interviewing and recruiting for roles in the school, whether that's teaching roles or support roles, a lot of people are pleasantly surprised that we are very normal, approachable, down-to-earth kind of people, and that we are, absolutely part of the fabric of the city and woven into its history and its geography and its buildings, and not some sort of rarefied abstraction. And that's quite frustrating. And I grew up in Bolton, and it's not exactly a enclave of wealth or of affluence or of pomposity. And I guess I have just continued that sort of straightforward, down-to-earth northernness everywhere I've been. But again, all of the colleagues that I've worked with and taught alongside and learned from have displayed, a very similar normalness, and I would encourage those parents just to come and have a look at us as the independent sector, and to realise that we're not sort of some strange or rarefied abstraction of reality, but simply places where their children will really get a fantastic education in the broadest sense of that word. Yes, they will get a good exam grades, but that's not enough. They will get all sorts of other things that, alas, are all too often not on offer in a large number of state schools. The co-curricular springs particularly to mind, and all of those other opportunities that our staff often go more than the extra mile for. So, no, I suppose that would be my biggest thing to try to just debunk or
together we can change the views eventually. It's a commonly held view, and like you, of all of the schools I've stepped into, the kind of sense of normalness, the values that we share across the sector of wanting to do good really do shine through. So I think that's really is a myth that deserves to be debunked. Thank you very much, Stefan, for your time today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I love that we've started by thinking about the operational changes and how to think more strategically about some of those operational changes that have been forced upon us during COVID. The idea of catching up with the times, with our technology and with our expectations of parents. And also really important conversation around the importance of bursaries, the kind of social justice role that schools have to play, and diversifying income streams and fundraising critically important within that. And the thread I think that runs through our conversation is this idea of storytelling, the idea of really finding a compelling narrative to get people on board, to persuade them that you're authentically committed to your school, to bursaries, to access, and that's the way to unlock people's support over time. So thank you so much for your time today, Stefan. It's been wonderful to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you, Juliet. I've really enjoyed it too. And thanks everyone for listening.
Cool. So that's it for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.